Hello, everyone. I hope you're all keeping well. My name is Natalie Turvey. I'm President and Executive Director of the Canadian Journalism Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's special event and our final webcast of 2021, Behind the Scenes, an inside look at the Globe and Mail's award-winning investigations. Before we get to our program, I would like to take a moment to thank you for joining us today on Giving Tuesday. None of the CJF's work is possible without the help of our donors and sponsors. Your contributions go a long way in supporting CJF programs, including fellowships for emerging Black and Indigenous journalists, awards for excellence in journalism, research and education, and this speaker series featuring journalism thought leaders and important conversations on the issues of our time. If you would like to support Canadian journalism this Giving Tuesday, you can donate now or anytime on the CJF website. We are so grateful for your support of our mission. And now on to our program. The CJF is honored to partner with the Globe and Mail on today's event. The foundation has a strong tradition of collaboration with the Globe, including a successful investigative journalism fellowship that ran for 4 years and brought emerging talent to the Globe's newsroom to pursue a year-long investigative journalism project under the guidance of some of the country's best reporters and editors. And today we have the unique opportunity to be joined by some of those reporters who mentored and worked alongside our fellows for an in-depth look at excellence in investigative journalism, from pitches to research and cultivating sources, navigating obstacles, and the resulting impact of their work for the good of the Canadian public. It is my pleasure to welcome Renata D'Alessio, Head of Investigations at the Globe and Mail, to share a few words about the Globe's commitment to journalism that matters.
Thank you, Natalie. Early in my reporting career, after my last semester of university, I hit the road for a reporting contract in Albuquerque. The experience was an eye-opening introduction into the massive gulf in access to information between the US and Canada. In Albuquerque, I was able to obtain police investigative reports simply by walking into a station and asking for them. That doesn't happen in Canada. Government officials spoke freely to the media. No one cited privacy as the reason to decline to comment. My experience in New Mexico helped me to understand why investigative journalism is so much tougher here. It takes great fortitude, determination, and a lot of time to break through the many barriers to information. The Globe does this daily through our investigative and data teams and in our business, political, and foreign coverage. Investigative journalism is a part of our culture, and the work of Globe journalists has led to meaningful change. We're fortunate to have three of our best join us today to take us behind the scenes of their remarkable stories. Thank you to Natalie and the CJF for organizing today's panel.
Thank you, Renata. A reminder to everyone that our discussion today is an hour long, and you can still submit questions for our speakers at any time via the tab on your screen. And if you'd like to tweet about today's conversation, our hashtag is Journalism Matters. I'm delighted to welcome three award-winning Globe and Mail investigative journalists to our virtual stage today. Tom Cardoso, Grant Robertson, and Chen Wang join us from Toronto. They're in conversation with David Mackay, veteran investigative journalist and deputy managing editor of Canada's National Observer, who joins us from Ottawa. We are honored to have them on our stage today. David, over to you.
I've been looking forward to this ever since I was invited, so thanks for the invitation, because these are journalists whose work that I've read, I've thought about, I've talked about in my journalism classes at Carleton, at Ryerson, at the University of King's College, and will be talking about at UBC this winter. And so all my journalists, all my students know about the tremendous work that you folks have done and will continue to do. You know, the hashtag is really important. Journalism matters. And this is journalism that matters at a time when journalism is being questioned. We are being questioned about our methods. We're being questioned about our reliability, about whether or not we are relevant anymore, about whether or not anyone's reading us. And I think that after this conversation, you will hopefully be inspired, in addition to the great information that you'll be getting. So not too much more from me. I want to get to these guys to talk about what they've done, how they've done it. And what I've also asked them to do is to kind of think about tips that they want to pass on to the folks who are joining us here and the folks who will be taking in this recording at a later date, because part of this is inspiration. And it's inspiration that comes from knowing that you are using the tools that some of the best in the business are using. So I've asked them to put together a bit of a tip sheet that they can dispense at any point during this discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to start with you, Grant, in large part because now we are dealing with another variant, the Omicron. We are in the middle of a pandemic. I don't know when we're going to get out, but your work, your excellent work, really had a lot to do with the pandemic preparedness and so on. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's interesting you mentioned the variant because, you know, what I'm seeing happen now, I think is very different than what we saw in early 2020 in terms of how Canada responded back then to some of the things we're doing now. So the work I did reporting on the pandemic, really, it began with one question, which is what was going wrong with our pandemic response? Why wasn't this going better? And you really had to sort of, it began with looking back at SARS, which was, you know, a uniquely Canadian problem, you know, just after the turn of the century, and 44 people died. And there was a lot of decisions made back then to ensure this wouldn't happen again. And you sort of had to look back and say, okay, those 44 people should not have died in vain. There were systems put in place to prepare for the next one, to prepare for the big one. So what's going on? We could see the problems in early 2020 happening: long-term care, you know, migrant workers, healthcare workers, frontline, everything. So it began with that one question. And really the investigation, just to quickly summarize it, it spanned three major stories. The first one in May of 2020 looked at essentially just what were our pandemic preparedness plans and why weren't they followed? And that one, it was a big undertaking, but it was a fairly easy story to begin on because those are all public documents. So you pull the pandemic plans and you start going through them. You compare what's happening to what should have happened. And that really opened up, I think, a door to bigger stories that we did not expect. After we did that story, we started getting information coming out of the public health department. And one of the most damning things that I'd heard is somebody said, somebody called me up and said, we had a pandemic early warning system. It was staffed by, you know, a dozen or so very sophisticated people, and it had a great reputation globally for tracking H1N1. It was one of the big reasons H1N1 didn't become a problem, and it was leaned on heavily by Africa to track and detect Ebola outbreaks. Sometimes we were detecting Ebola outbreaks before they were being detected in Africa. That's how good this thing was. And I was amazed. I said, great, well, you know, what happened to it? Where is it? What's it doing right now? And they said they shut it down, or they basically shut down most of its operations and transitioned its work into other areas. And this happened less than a year before the pandemic. And it was one of those moments where people are telling you information and you just don't believe it. It just sounds so apocryphal. And so that comprised the second element of the investigation. And then the last leg of it that ran, I think in December, was a story looking at how people inside public health had warned for the past couple of years that Canada wasn't ready if a big pandemic hit. And those messages were trying to be pushed up the chain of command and they were being blocked. And I think the most disturbing revelation from that one was that we had actually built a new pandemic preparedness plan and we hadn't practiced it. It sat on the shelf in about 2018 and we never exercised it, which they're required to do. And that was another one where it started to paint a picture of why when COVID hit in 2020, we looked like we were constantly scrambling.
What were some of the key records you used?
For the first story, it was simply, let's pull all the pandemic preparedness plans. And then after that, so you're having people reach out to you with information, and it's a lot of off the record information. The problem there is, people need to protect their jobs, and people have livelihoods and families. And, there's a lot of people that I spoke to that were speaking because they believe this information needed to be out in the public sphere. It shouldn't be hidden inside government because, government doesn't want to be blamed for problems. So they're speaking out. I really admire these people's motives for doing it. The challenge as a journalist is to take that information and say, how can I get this on record? And so then you need to take the information you've been given, and then whether it's through access to information requests or branching out and talking to other sources and piecing together on the record information. So you talk about records and documents. That was really the task.
Mm-hmm. And I'm asking, I will ask all of you this right off the bat, because I've got a feeble memory and I know I will forget and I'll beat myself up forever. But in terms of tips, if you had, say, 5 or 6 tips that you could pass along to all of us, what would they be?
Do you want my 5 right now?
Yeah.
Great. Well, I right off the top, I would say an investigation starts with a simple question all the time. The investigations can seem complex. I had people say to me afterwards, the pandemic early warning system was called GFIN. It's an acronym. It was a very arcane thing in a remote part of the government. People said, well, how did that investigation lead to GFIN? Nobody knew it existed. But it really began with a simple question: what went wrong here? And so that's my first tip. Start with a simple question and keep an open mind, because you don't know where that question is going to lead. Number 2 is re-ask questions. Go back. So one of the the great moments of this investigation, I think, was when I had pieced together information about that this department had been sort of silenced within government. I posed the question to the department, to the public relations officers, and said, okay, I need to know why this has been effectively shut down. The answer that came back was, it hasn't. And so as a reporter, my job then becomes go out and get more information, verify it 3-4 times over. And once you can do that, you go back and you re-ask the question. And once they knew, one of the things we did is we got the database that showed that this alert system had alerted, for the past decade, thousands of times, and then it stopped in May 2019. You could not debate it once you saw this database. So I went back to the government, I re-asked the question, and they said, oh, well, the answer that came back was, well, it hasn't been shut down, it just doesn't work anymore, was essentially, which is a hilarious answer. And it told you that they were obfuscating. It told you that, okay, now they're not being honest about the answers, and a complete confidence saying that. They tried to obfuscate that answer. And at that point, you're working on a real investigation because the information is being prevented. Third tip is have a plan to protect your sources. If whistleblowers, they only work if we can protect them. The system only works. So have a plan to ensure that these people aren't going to be exposed, because I've seen it with companies, and I saw it with the government in this case. Within the department, people were under suspicion, and there was pressure put on people. And I know it happened, and so you have to have a plan to make sure that people who are bringing out public information that really, really matters are protected. Number 4, real quick, filter out agendas. When you talk to people for any investigation, you're going to get people coming from all sides with different agendas. That's okay. Everybody has an agenda. In the story, I was talking to a lot of public health people. I was talking to a lot of people in the Canada security complex, people who talk about national security, because this is a national security issue. Those people all have different viewpoints. And, some people you're talking, they may not like their, who their boss is. And, so you have to be able to filter out where they're coming from and just get to the information that's being conveyed. And my last tip would be, I think I would, when you look at access to information requests, one thing I really learned from this was use the information people are giving you. And, a lot of times when we do access to information requests, we put them in cold. It just gives me the documents on this subject. But one of the things I was taught on this one was there's people inside these departments that know which documents exist and where they exist. So a lot of times as journalists, we get told, well, that information can't be found, that document doesn't exist. On this one, there were a few documents I requested where I knew exactly the email I needed, exactly the document number I needed. And what it told me is on future investigations that I really want to speak to the people who know where the documents live, even if those people need to be protected. So that's my 5.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Grant. Okay, Chen, I'm going to come to you. The thing I really admired about the piece the stories that you did with Robin is that you dug into records that had been around seemingly forever. Sunshine lists, executive salaries. I don't know how many classes I've used these to stress the point that we have to get beyond the obvious, right? The obvious is, yes, we know that certain CEOs make $1 million plus. Okay, fine. But what else can we do with that? And you were able to use that to really, I think, dig and probe and ask some very important questions about executive compensation and fairness. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I will circle back to this, but probably I can start with introducing myself because I come from a different team than Grant and Tom. Tom and I used to be in the same team, so he can speak for both. But I come from, I joined the Globe 3.5 years ago as a data journalist. So I'm at this department called Visual Journalism Department. So we're in editorial, but we're a group of data people like me, developers, designers, photographers. So I had this difficult time identifying myself as a journalist or not. And I got this question a lot, are you a journalist or are you a supporting role like analyst or something like that? So I think it matters how you identify yourself, not the kind of work you do. So my daily work is acquiring data, analyzing data, and work with reporters, editors to report out the stories and present the stories. And back to, so I have opportunities to work on this long-term investigative work, as well as some short-term quick turnaround stories, daily stories, especially during the pandemic that everything goes so quick. So back to the project I'm going to talk about, which is Power Gap. When I joined the project, the story already started several months already. So we started a pilot analysis for this project. So Robin, the co-author of also the lead reporter of this project, she was working on the Unfounded project, which is also, I think a lot of people know it. And near the end of the project, she was thinking what's the next big thing to do? And she wanted to move on to something. So Unfounded was about how police handled sexual thoughts in Canada. She's thinking about something broader project about the gender equality. As you mentioned, a sunshine list attracted her attention. That is there anything we can do about this public data to analyze, to examine the women's position in Canadian workplace. We don't want to just focus on the top jobs, the highest paid people, but we also want to look into the trajectories within each organization, because there's some big numbers available, for example, stats can say women paid 13% less than men, but that's an aggregate big number, but you won't really know if the person next to me with the same job title paid the same as me or not. Is my organization paying the same as the other organization? Salary is a sacred in most places. So we had to rely on this public sector salary to do this analysis. And when I joined this project, we were trying to do some pilot analysis to test this hypothesis. Because if people are familiar with the project, we apply this analysis across the country in different provinces, in different sectors. So we know there's a salary gap there, but is this available everywhere? We don't want start sending requests to everyone and find out it's only concentrated in one province or one sector. So we tested the idea on 3 provinces, which had this public disclosure available on their website to compile the data set. So it's Ontario, BC,
Alberta?
and founded.
Alberta?
Yeah, I think 3 of them. So and we found, so there's still a salary gap. The bigger question is there's a extensive lack of women in those decision making. So that's when we shifted our focus from the salary to a little bit to the power gap, like the representation of women. So in our final project, we dug into both the salary, but also what's the representation at the top, what's the representation from the bottom salary band to the top salary band. And when I'm saying bottom salary bands, it's still above this 100K threshold. So it's still pretty high salary, but again, this is a limitation to the data available, only the people making this much money are available there. So another thing I want to mention, we only have public sector as part of the project. So we try to include the other part of the workplace as well. So in our first installment, we also took a look at the TSX composite index companies, even though it's only 200 companies, I think, but that's the best data we were able to get. And also you can see my talk is more on the data part of it, but there's a lot of work, investigative work by Robin, by Tavia Grant, by Christine Doby, who looked into law firms, private companies in between these data-driven stories. So I think I'm gonna stop here.
and what about tips? Because you have a very interesting background. I believe you have an MBA. And you also taught yourself how to, you went to school to learn how to code and so on, so you know how to do that. That's a very potent combination that allows you to do the kind of deep dive that you've done. So in terms of tips that you can pass along to people who might want to do similar work, what would they be?
Yeah, I have tips on both career switcher and investigative work. I can start with the career switching one. I think my first tip is starting, if you want to learn a new skill or even you want to change your career, start with the cheaper options first. Start with something that you don't need to pay money for. There are a lot of things available online, resources, there's scholarships, there's all this kind of programs you need to do your homework. So don't feel like if I want to change my career, I need to enroll in a master program or something like that. So try the cheaper option first. But there's a second part of this tip, if you find yourself not making progress or you are not disciplined to sit down to learn something, pay down some money for some offline course, face-to-face course, not online to face-to-face course, and immerse yourself in a group of people that heading to the same goal and do some projects together. That will take you to where you want to go. The second one is be patient. I struggled a little bit during when I just joined the Globe. This is my first newsroom experience. So it took some time to navigate, to find how does this imagining work, how to connect with people. And if you focus on the short term, all the obstacles look so big. But if you focus on long term, these obstacles will become smaller. So I would say people tend to underestimate how much you can achieve in 5 years, in 3 years, but overestimate how much you can achieve in several months or a year. So I would say be patient about yourself. A lot of skills, or a lot of work just takes time. Investigation work, it takes years, it takes a month. So it's very common that, and I also want to Uncle Grant's question about a great tip about like focusing on starting with the basic questions, starting with the simple questions, because especially during my early projects, I'm very easily being attracted by like those very exciting, intriguing questions at once. Like for example, I was working on an investigative piece on abandoned oil wells in the Western Canada. And I was so excited about like, oh, what's the transitions between the companies, like this suspicious things happening. But when editor asking me like, oh, so how many wells are we talking about? Like, what's the distribution by status of these wells? I didn't know, but those are the basic questions to help you understand and have the big picture about what's going on. So that's some lessons I learned along the way that start with the basic ones, and that they will take you to the more complex questions. And my last tip is when you, I think like Grant also mentioned like being open-minded. And I have another tip about like being more specific, not like interviewing people. It's more about collaborations with other people or within organizations. It's better to give options than open-ended questions. Say you tell someone, your editor, should I do A or B? But don't say, what should I do? You give them some options, and it will make other parties work easier, and also give you some control about the work you want to do, because you make the option A and option B. So if you give open question, the other party will feel like you are not doing any homework. And if they give you something that out of control, you have to take it. So yes, that's the four tips for me.
Okay, great. Tom, what can you say about Tom? He's done some amazing work. The overall CAJ winner for Investigative project. You've looked at racism within the penitentiary system. You looked at some of the interesting ways that companies were taking advantage of wage subsidies, using, again, a database that a lot of us had kind of looked at online, but never really went beyond that. And I could go on, but so talk a little bit about some of the work that you've done, and then we can go from there.
Sure. Yeah, my name's Tom. I'm an investigative journalist with the Globe and Mail. I'm on the same group as Grant, and I used to work, as Chen said, with Chen and those folks. So I guess my approach, you could say, has always been a little bit more interdisciplinary, to use an academic word. I tend to combine the style of work that Grant engages in with the style of work that Chen engages in, I would say. So it's a little bit of, data encoding and whatever, and a little bit of, source development, digging up documents, talking to people, and kind of mashing those two together as best as I can. I think a story that, exemplifies that pretty well is a project that, I always hate using the P word. It makes it sound bigger than it is. It's a story that I began working on back in, 2018. This was following there were a couple of very high profile trials in Canada at the time. There was the Gerald Stanley trial, as well as the Raymond Cormier trial. And both of those led to acquittals. And in both cases, there had been a fair bit of media coverage about the jury and the racial composition of the jury. There were questions raised about whether, an almost entirely white jury or wholly white jury was capable of understanding some of the nuance that was being discussed in those cases. And so, to Grant's point about asking a simple question, at the time I wondered what the racial composition of juries is in this country. Are they often white? Are they something else? What are their backgrounds? Even beyond race, social demographics, geography, what have you. And quickly learned it's impossible, basically, to figure that out. No one tracks this stuff for understandable reasons around, privacy and whatnot. But that question morphed a couple of times over into a question about sentencing and the types of people who are getting sentenced and the types of sentences that they're receiving. From there, I dropped a freedom of information requests in the mail. I use freedom of information requests a lot in my work. I file an FOI every week if I can, if I have an idea. I think right now I probably have about 40 open. Most of them are terribly, terribly late, and maybe see them in a couple of years if I'm lucky. But what I got back was this enormous database of data on people who are in federal prison, including these odd risk scores that I'd never really considered before. Some people were maximum security, some people were minimum security, some people were rated as having a low reintegration potential score or a high reintegration potential score. And that became the genesis of a series of stories that began running late last year on the systemic inequities in the federal prison system. These risk assessments, as it turns out, are extremely important. So when you're first admitted to federal prison for any charge that's, any sentence of 2 years or longer, you are going to be run through this battery of tests, and parole officers will assign you a set of scores, including security designation, maximum security. You're likely going to be in a cell on a range with other maximum security people. If you get assigned a minimum security rating, you might be living in suite style dorms. You have a lot more freedom of movements. You might be able to even leave the prison during the day to go to work or whatever. So really, a lot of differences in how these risk scores affect people. And they're quite simple. Some of these risk tests are 12-question multiple choice type forms. But what I found using, again, the kind of approach that Chen is a master at, it was that these scores, after accounting for age, gender, the severity of the person's offense, their criminal history, after accounting for all that stuff, they were effectively biased against Black and Indigenous people. The race alone had an impact. And that's really not how the system is supposed to work at all. So, that led to a whole whack of stories, in part because it's a really complex topic and not one that I really understood before when I dropped that FOI in the mail. It was really, I was interested in looking at something completely different. And I find that that's often defined some of my work is taking these sharp left or right turns along the way. I don't think I've worked on a single story where I ended up where I thought I would at the outset. The question, you let the question lead you and it takes you wherever it does. And so, that story on the wage subsidy that you mentioned earlier, that we did earlier this year, that turned out to be something very different than what we thought it would be. In part, it was a story about, why is the government not publishing how much each company has received in wage subsidies? They still haven't to this day.
No, they don't.
This story about prisons began as a thing about juries, which I never did anything with. So I find that, being flexible in that way and being limber, journalistically speaking, has been really useful.
So what about tips?
Yeah, I'll fly through these because I'm sure we have a bunch of questions pouring in from people. The first one, I just like to echo what Grant was saying, file freedom of information requests. They are an amazing source of knowledge and inspiration. Sometimes I'll file stuff that I don't even really, I don't know what I'm going to get. I'm just curious. A great example of this, perhaps a little bit apocryphal, I don't know. I filed a request a year and a half ago about UFOs. I was curious, is the Canadian government seeing a lot of these things? There's been stuff in the New York Times about UFOs. What's going on? And I only got a few pages back, which is kind of what I expected. I'm kind of glad it wasn't, an enormous tome, because I don't think I would have had the patience to read through all of it. But that led to, a fun story over the holidays last year about some of the weirder things that people in the armed forces see in the dead of night, things that are hard to explain. They're probably planets or stars or whatever, meteors, who care, whatever. But, still a fun thing to kind of look into. And of course, most of the FOIs I file are a lot more serious than that. But filing FOIs, huge. You can only benefit from doing that kind of work and stretching that kind of muscle, especially given that FOIs are so broken in this country right now, as Renata was mentioning earlier. It's access to information is a real problem. And, look no further than the current, law in BC that is some people are concerned is going to restrict access to government public information. So file FOIs. Number two, really, really quickly, I would say, pick up the phone. It's something that I can never do too much of. I think I probably drive my partner and my neighbors nuts with the amount of time I spend on the phone every single day, especially when I'm working on something of investigative nature. I'm calling a new person or a couple of new people a day and just introducing myself and awkwardly trying to figure out, okay, is this person going to be willing to talk to me? What's their vibe like? But you can only, again, benefit from talking to people and trying to build out your network as much as possible. And some stories, it's not unusual for investigative reporters to have over 100 people that they've contacted by the end, many of whom become really reliable sources. Number three, I don't think all investigative work has to take years. Chen's work has taken years in the past, and that's because she tackles a kind of scope of storytelling that just is impossible to do on a short timeline. And I've done a little bit of the short stuff and the long stuff, but there's no reason why an investigative project can't take a month or less. Again, I use the P word, didn't mean to do that. There's no reason why you can't dig into something, become an expert on it, and produce a story within a couple of weeks or a month. Finally, or third, really quickly, is or fourth, I think this is often a question that people have about investigative work is, the story you wrote about the wage subsidy or about the Global Public Health Information Network or about oil wells, you guys are experts on this stuff. We weren't at the beginning. As Grant said, he didn't know anything about GFIN until he had to. I didn't know anything about prison risk scores until I had to. So I think a defining trait of a good investigative journalist is the ability to become an expert on something really quickly and go from zero to, being able to have a knowledgeable, deep conversation with a source very quickly and being able to absorb that information. So there has to be kind of a voraciousness to your, hunger for research and knowledge and asking stupid questions, which is basically my entire job, is saying, well, is that really, how does this work? I don't really understand this really basic concept in your field. And so, yeah, just say, don't feel like you need to know anything about the thing that you'd like to look into. In fact, it's kind of fun to not know anything. I didn't know anything about the wage subsidy. Chen is she has 14 degrees, but I don't think any of those are in oil exploration or, drilling or whatever. And finally, in the minute that I have left here, just I would say consider impact in all of your work. That's something that the Globe has really drilled into us over the last few years is when we work on an investigative story, I almost used the P word again, I try to always think about the impact that story could have. Who is meant to be reading the story? What is the impact that we expect, these revelations to have, and we try to work backwards from there to a certain extent. So that's not to say that we're trying to steer, the direction of the response or anything like that. Absolutely not. But we are thinking about things in terms of, okay, if there's an injustice, we would like to expose it in such a way that it can be fixed, so that the government can go and address it and figure out what has to be done. If there are oil wells that are being ignored in Alberta, then someone has to look into that, right? So we, as much as possible, we try to think about impact from day one, from the very first day where we're posing that question that Grant so eloquently put earlier.
Okay, that's great, and I'm really glad that that you talked about the fact that investigations don't have to take months and months and years. I mean, I've worked on investigations that have taken that long, and I've worked on other investigations that you've been able to do in a few months, because I think that what we don't want to do is to intimidate people, for people to say, well, geez, we don't have that time or whatever. The key is that you use some of these techniques to take a deep dive, right? Yeah. And then you go from there. So yeah. I'm glad that you brought that up, because that's a really important point, I think, for anyone looking to do this kind of meaningful work. Now, we do have some questions, so I want to put them to you right away here. And the first question I have is from Natasha Belowski. And this, I guess I can throw it out to all of you. What is the most logistically challenging part of your jobs as investigative reporters? Grant, why don't you start?
I'll go first. had to think about that for a second because there's many.
I know. I gave you guys time to think. Yeah.
Yeah. You know what it is? It's information management. It's and this goes right through. Like I find this forms a big chunk of any investigation. Is as you've got things coming in, documents, your access to information requests are coming back. You've got your interviews, your transcripts. Tom talked about talking to many people. I think for the public health stuff that I wrote last year, easily talked to more than 50. I'm sure the number is much higher. Not all of those people are making it into the story, but you're using information from everybody and from all the documents and so cataloging that and determining what's most relevant and what's going to go where and what you need to follow up on and get more information on. That to me is always the biggest challenge because if an investigation is going well, when all of a sudden you're a couple of weeks in and the paper's stacking up around you, that's usually a good sign. And one of the things I usually think about when I'm doing my second draft, which is usually when you're just cutting things out, like if I'm writing a 5,000 word piece, if I've got 10,000 words before I do my final draft, that tells me I'm leaving a lot on the cutting room floor, and that's good. And so getting to that point where you've cataloged all the information, you've managed it, and you've got the best stuff for the final draft. I think that's always the biggest challenge, and I spend a lot of time on that.
Okay, Chen.
Yeah, I want to answer the question from my perspective as a more like a supporting role in investigation, because I think the angle is a little bit different. And the difficult a lot of time to me is to stay focused and to understand the question we are trying to answer, because I get involved in project at different stages, sometimes very early stage, and reporters either don't even know like what we are trying to do here. So it's really easy to lose the focus and dig into some rabbit holes. And a lot of times people approach you without having those angles. So you need to figure out where to focus. And also one thing I want to mention is, especially during that early stage, as a supporting role, you don't need to feel like you are responsible for the story already, or you want to impress them with some big ideas. They come to you just to want to hear your knowledge. I want to hear your opinions. So just to say, what do you think? What you already know? And over time, those dots will connect and will lead you to the big story. And by that time, we will enter the next stage to work very closely on this big story. But like before that, the difficulty will be like just to keep talking to reporters, keep talking to editors, and also like have your own opinions along the way. Yeah.
Okay. Tom.
Well, I feel like Grant and Chen have stolen all the good answers, but I'll say that one thing that always goes unconsidered, at least by me until it's happening, is once you filed and you enter that negotiation phase with your editors about what goes in, what comes out, when should this run, what kind of presentation are we going to work on for this or whatever. That stuff can be very logistically challenging because you're no longer talking about what is the story, but you're talking about how do we refine what the story is to a sharp point, right? And sometimes that means dropping a bunch of information or anecdotes, as Grant mentioned, or it might mean rethinking what the format is, right? Like rewriting the story entirely once you've written it once because you wrote it the first time and realized, here's 14 holes in the story. I have to go find someone who fits this profile because I have to talk to, a parole officer, or I have to go talk to a oil wells inspector or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. That kind of stuff really only becomes clear once you filed. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a weird process where you're almost, in some cases reinvestigating the topic for a mm-hmm. second time once you've written your first draft and realized what you currently have. It's very hard to, at least for me, I don't have any idea how strong the story is or what the gaps might be until I write it down. And then it becomes clear. So I find that can be a pretty intense experience.
Which is why, you have to write many drafts, because it's in the writing of the repeated drafts that you see holes in the story that you think, oh, geez, I got to go back and plug this hole, right?
And assembling your thoughts too.
Yeah.
I don't assemble my thoughts until I write, because I don't actually know what structure my thoughts should take. They're all just this amorphous blob in my mind until that moment comes to be. Grant,
you were just going to jump in with a comment there?
I think you're exactly right. Yeah, exactly. That's really when the holes start to emerge. I find when you do your first draft, I often do my first draft just to see what holes are there, because they're going to be there.
Yeah. I find that if you're unsure about your story, that's a great way to go. Write a terrible draft that's only for yourself, and it'll become very obvious. Okay, well, I have to really understand this thing, and I don't really get it right now, or whatever.
Okay, all right. My second question is from Catherine Burr. It's a multi-part question, but I'm going to go with the last question. So what do you predict will be trending in the next few years? And in terms of trending, I think she's meaning what kind of topics, what should be on our collective radar as journalists, as investigative journalists? Who wants to take a first crack at that?
I'll go.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I think the story of the century of our lives, perhaps of the end of our lives, is climate change. And so, I can't imagine that people aren't going to start to turn some of these investigative tools towards that kind of storytelling and that kind of reporting. It's something that we're going to see a lot more of as we bring in restrictions around emissions and as we start to really police this stuff. There was a great piece in the New York Times a year or two ago talking about, unregulated methane emissions, and they used these special cameras to look for, plumes of methane being emitted without a license or what have you. I think we're going to start seeing a lot more of that, because it's going to be so hard to keep track of what's actually going on. And with, again, carbon pricing put in and much tighter environmental controls, we're going to start seeing a lot of malfeasance, a lot of people skirting the rules, and a lot of gaps in the regulatory system itself. So I would imagine that we're going to start seeing a lot of really powerful reporting on that stuff. I mean, we already have a lot, but it's not something that I've personally ever explored, and I would love to at some point.
Yeah, and maybe that will get some added momentum coming out of COP26. I mean, we don't know. I guess we'll have to see. Chen, what do you think?
Yeah, so it could be a reporting perspective, but also about data per se. Is about data transparency and data gap. We did a project on data gap, and also it is also a big part of our power gap project that we get a lot of questions. Did you analyze say a transgender group of people? Did you visualize the men and women? And we if you're familiar with the project, we did some of that for the top 1 percentile, but because of the availability of the data, we only able to do that for the top 1 percentile people. So I feel like the government should put more resources to make this available. And I think there's a change of mindset as well, from afraid of violating people's privacy to a mindset that how can we collect and share data better without violating privacy. And I think there's a story this morning from my colleague, Jeff Keller, about, so it's also hurting out how we handle the pandemic as well. The federal and the provincial government should have set standards to standardize for the data collection and the sharing. And now a lot of departments are in those silos. They collect in their own data, but it cannot be merged. It's all different across departments. It causes a lot of problems for our work. And as we mentioned, and we were talking about what's the definition of investigation? It doesn't need to be long, but our project that took such a long time because it took months to collect the data, then took months to clean the data. If the government can do their part to make our life easier, I guess this could be much shorter, and I can move on to another project, I guess.
Well, as you mentioned, I mean, that story was in your paper this morning, and I couldn't help thinking that, maybe some of the stories that we should be doing is, this is what we can't tell you. This is what we would love to tell you, but this is what we can't tell you because governments aren't sharing, they're not maintaining their data, they're just not putting enough work into this. And I think as journalists collectively, we've always been a little shy about telling people what we don't know or what we can't tell them. And I think that maybe we have to get over that. Grant.
This is a really good question. I'm going to answer it slightly differently in that I don't think a lot about where trends are going and what they're going to be. And the reason for that is the fundamental questions of investigative reporting and journalism writ large, but really investigative reporting, really are always the same. It's always the same questions, no matter what the actual story is. And what I mean by that is, I spent, 10 to 15 years as a business reporter. I've got a lot of background in business reporting. And, every time you see a stock market fraud, every time you see that sort of white collar crime going on or just stock fraud, it's always a different flavor, but it's always the same fundamental question, and it always occurs in a hot market. So, in the late 90s, early 2000s, we had the tech boom, and then we had a lot of tech fraud come out of that, a lot of stock problems come out of that in the markets. Well, then, later on in the same decade, we had, different flavors of that. And, so one thing when I talk about business reporting, I say, in a hot market, you're going to see stock fraud going on. Because that's where it flourishes. The question's always the same. The trend is different. Like if you were to ask me, 3 years from now, what's going to be the trend in stock fraud? I don't know, but it's going to be there, and you'll see it in the hot market. So I don't worry too much about trends. The question of where's the money going? That's always a question with governments. What's going to be the government spending scandal 4 years from now? I don't know, but there will be one. And the question will always be, where's the money going and how's it being spent? And is that appropriate? And so I sort of, the trends will come to us. We just have to be watching for them.
Okay. All right. That's good. Follow the money, which has become a mantra, but one that cannot be repeated often enough. Okay. That's good. We are sadly running out of time. So I think we can squeeze in a couple of more questions before we end. So here's one. How do you decide which story? This is from Jay Callahan, by the way. How do you decide which stories to pursue? Do your own life experiences influence those choices, for instance? So who wants to take a crack at that one?
I'll go first real quick.
Okay.
And then pass it on. My answer is really quick. What really interests me, and some very colleagues that I've looked up to over the years, somebody had a good saying once. What upsets you? What gets you, what angers you? Because that's usually an injustice. And, looking back at the pandemic coverage, yes, there's a responsibility as a journalist, but when you look at certain things going on and bad decisions being made and people dying because of it, I have to admit, it's tough not to get upset about that.
Okay. Tom?
I think I'll give the one-word answer that just, I think, encapsulates what Grant just said. Gut. I just go with my gut. One thing I've learned is to trust my gut in a lot of my work. If something doesn't sound right, or someone, if something suspicious seems like it's going on, or if I just get a weird vibe, I tend to scratch at that, itch, if you will, or trust my gut wherever it takes me. So, I don't really know it until I see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Chen?
Well, I sometimes take inspiration from other people's work. So when I see something, this is more like data or visual wise. When I see something and I will like, I hope that I can do that as well. So circle back to like what we want to see the trend. I hope that more people will do methodologies from a data journalist perspective. How did you do it? Share like what kind of obstacles you have, like the conversation we are having today. Is there a way for me to duplicate the work and learn something, then I can build on top of that? So that's kind of things. I read some project, oh, like this is so awesome. I hope that I can do it as well. I hope that I can do this visualization as well. So that's something inspire me.
Okay, I want to pivot from that just to put a very last question to you, which is sort of it's a question that emerges from a lot of the other questions that we unfortunately can't get to, and that is obstacles. So if you had to think about, there are many obstacles that you encounter all the time, but what would be a key one that you either consistently encounter or have encountered recently and figured out ways to get around? Who wants to? Chen, you want to keep going?
Yeah. I would say it's hard to decide if you want to start big or if you start small. Like for our Power Gap project, we did this pilot analysis because it would take so much resources if you go really big and reach everyone. But if you only reach 100 of them, like, you know, it will take a month to have them to respond to you. So you need to find that sweet spot that you reach enough people, but like it don't like overwhelm your resources. So I think it's also case by case. For this one, we used this pilot analysis to test it on several provinces, and if the hypothesis is true, like let's expand it to more sectors. But that was also a period of time that we realized some organizations, they don't have enough people to conduct this analysis. It's just not statistically robust. So we had to scale back a little bit. So initially we want to do all municipalities in this country. Then we find, some municipalities just like they don't have enough people make that benchmark. So let's just leave them. We wanted to like include as many entities as possible. So we need to like come up with some methodology to do it statistically right. But I just found it very difficult to understand where is that sweet spot, like at the very beginning. Yeah.
Right. Grant?
I'll mention two big obstacles real quick. One comes at the beginning, one comes at the end. The biggest obstacle that comes at the beginning is people stop talking. And to me, that's when investigative reporting begins. It's when people stop talking. That's when you know. And that's when you know you've started an investigation. And then at the end, I find with every really good investigation, and I know all my colleagues face it, it's the spin and the misinformation that comes out afterwards. How people will try to tell you that, that didn't really happen. And, so you make sure you've done enough work on the front end to prepare for the inevitable blowback you're going to get, and then work through that, because companies will say that they didn't do anything wrong when they have done something wrong. Governments will say the same thing, and your job as an investigative reporter is to double down and not let them get away with that if that's their approach after the story comes out.
Okay, great. Tom?
Yeah, 30 seconds. I think the government often becomes its own biggest obstacle. And honestly, I think often the successes and the stories that investigative journalists in this country produce are in spite of the government, not because of it, not because of an access to information or access to resources, but in spite of a lack of those things. The best example of this would be a story the Globe and Mail just ran the weekend before last, about Champlain Towers, the condos in Surfside in Florida. Drastic difference in the kinds of records that reporters could access through like a website for Florida's corporations register compared to in Canada, where they had to pay $4,000 almost to access all sorts of records that are available at your fingertips in the US, court records, you name it. So really, that access, which is only getting worse over time, I think is probably one of the biggest obstacles that I face on a daily basis.
Okay. Unfortunately, that's about it for our great discussion. So thanks, Tom, Grant, and Chen. We've learned a lot from your insights and experiences, and thanks to all of you for joining us and submitting your questions. Wish we could have gotten to more of them, but yeah, there's just too much good stuff to talk about. So this concludes the fall 2021 J Talks season. A reminder that you can find videos and podcasts of past talks on the CJF site. The CJF will return to the virtual stage in February 2022 with a new J Talks live season. So to stay up to date on CJF events, please sign up for the newsletter or follow the Canadian Journalism Foundation on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Thanks everyone for watching. Be safe, and we hope to talk to you soon.